No footsteps rushing down crowded streets. No voices shouting over each other to be heard. No hum of engines, no clatter of dishes, not even the rustle of paper. Just a stillness so complete it feels as if time itself has paused to take a breath. One morning in a small mountain village, this happened. It wasn't caused by a storm or a power outage or some strange mechanical failure. The birds were still there, perched on old wooden fences. The river still flowed through the valley, but somehow the sound was gone. People stepped outside their homes, blinking into the daylight, glancing at each other in disbelief. Mouths moved, but no words came out. There was only an immense, velvety silence wrapping around everything. At first, there was panic. Hands waved frantically. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves. Merchants stomped their feet in frustration. How could life go on without the exchange of words, without the noise we've always known? And yet, as minutes turned into hours, something began to shift. People started noticing things they had never noticed before. The way sunlight painted golden edges on the leaves, the slow rhythm of their own breathing, the tiny tremor in their hands when they were afraid. Faces that were once glanced over in haste were now studied with quiet attention. Eyes spoke without sound. And in that strange, wordless day, an ancient truth revealed itself. We do not always need sound to understand. We do not always need to speak to connect. Silence has its own voice. It doesn't shout, it doesn't rush, but it carries a weight far heavier than noise. In the teachings of the Buddha, there is something called noble silence. It is not the awkward silence we try to fill at dinner parties. It is not the cold silence of avoidance. It is the kind of stillness that allows truth to rise like the moon over a dark horizon, slow, steady, unforced. In that mountain village, some felt restless. Their minds screamed louder than any market ever had, but others found themselves exhaling in relief. For the first time in years, they didn't have to answer, explain, argue, or defend. They could simply be. And maybe that's when wisdom began to whisper. Because wisdom's voice is not found in the chatter of the crowd. It's not in the rush to respond or the hunger to prove ourselves right. It comes in the pause between words, in the space between thoughts. It is born in the kind of listening that is so deep, it changes not just what we hear, but who we are. That day in that village, the silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt alive. It felt like the world was speaking in a different language, one without sound but full of meaning. And once you've heard that, you can never unhear it. Silence in our ordinary world is often misunderstood. Some think it means weakness, that if you don't speak, you have nothing to say. Others think it's emptiness, a void where nothing exists. But in the eyes of the Buddha, silence is neither weakness nor emptiness. It is fullness. It is a space so clear, so open, that truth can finally breathe. When the Buddha walked the dusty roads of ancient India, people followed him everywhere: kings, beggars, scholars, farmers. They came with questions, demands, even challenges. And yet, there were moments when he would answer with nothing. Not because he didn't know, not because he avoided the truth, but because the deepest truths cannot be forced into words. Words are like cups. They can hold a little, but they can never contain the ocean. Sometimes, the only way to point toward the ocean is to let the listener feel the vastness for themselves. This is what the Buddha called Arya Tu letter 1E47 Hi macron Bha macron V, a noble silence. It is a silence filled with presence, awareness, and understanding. It's the kind of silence that listens more than it speaks, that observes before it judges, that waits before it reacts. In the sutras, there is a story of a wandering ascetic who approached the Buddha and asked a question meant to trap him. Does the world have a beginning, or does it not? Is the soul eternal, or is it not? The Buddha simply sat in silence. The man waited. Minutes passed, still nothing. Eventually, the man walked away, confused. But those who were near him understood the question was born from a restless mind, not from the wish to be free. To answer it would only feed the restlessness. Silence in that moment was the most truthful and compassionate response. In Buddhist practice, silence is not just the absence of talking, it's the absence of clinging. When the mind stops grabbing for the next word, the next argument, the next clever reply, it becomes light, open, and still. It is in that stillness that insight arises. Not the kind of insight you read in books or hear in lectures, but the kind that changes the way you breathe, the way you walk, the way you meet the world. Silence is also a form of refuge. In the same way a bird returns to its nest at night, we return to silence to rest the mind. And in that rest, wisdom grows quietly, invisibly, like roots beneath the soil. And perhaps the greatest beauty of silence in Buddhism is that it's available to anyone, anywhere. You don't need to be a monk in a forest monastery. You don't need years of study. All you need is the willingness to stop, to listen, to let the dust of the world settle until the water of your mind becomes clear. When that happens, you begin to see things as they truly are. And in seeing clearly, you are no longer lost in the noise. Some say the Buddha's teachings are like a great bell that rings across the centuries. But sometimes, the deepest teaching is the space between the bell's strikes, the resonance that lingers after the sound fades away. And it is here, in this resonance, that we begin to hear the silence itself speak. Silence is rare now. Not because it has disappeared, but because we've forgotten how to enter it. The modern world hums with a constant, invisible vibration. It's in the streets, car horns slicing the air, engines growling, footsteps rushing. It's in our homes, the faint buzz of a refrigerator, the ping of a phone, the hum of electronics that never truly rest. Even in the dead of night, when the city sleeps, satellites whisper overhead and servers hum quietly in the dark, carrying messages to people we will never meet. But the loudest noise of all is the one inside our own minds. It starts the moment we wake, a flood of thoughts, plans, worries, replayed conversations, imagined arguments. Before our feet touch the floor, we've already had entire battles in our heads. And as the day unfolds, this mental noise competes with the external noise, blending into a restless storm that never truly stops. Technology has become our constant companion. The moment there's a pause in a cafe line at a red light between meetings, our hands reach for a screen. We scroll, swipe, and tap, not because we are curious, but because we are afraid of the stillness that might meet us if we stopped. In the Buddha's time, noise came from the marketplace, the debates in the king's court, the cries of animals, and the calls of merchants. Today, it is digital, invisible, yet relentless. We carry the marketplace in our pockets. The crowd follows us everywhere. And here lies the danger. When we are constantly surrounded by noise, we lose the ability to listen deeply, not just to others, but to ourselves. We no longer notice the quiet signals of the body telling us we are tired, anxious, or in need of rest. We no longer hear the subtle movements of the heart, guiding us toward compassion or away from harm. The Buddha taught that the mind, when agitated, is like a jar of water stirred with sand. The more we shake it, the cloudier it becomes. Noise is the stirring. It keeps the water muddy, making it impossible to see clearly. And yet, we have grown addicted to this stirring. Silence feels uncomfortable, even threatening, because it forces us to face the truth without distraction. So we choose the chatter, the music, the notifications, anything to avoid meeting ourselves in the mirror of stillness. But here's the paradox. The more we run from silence, the more restless we become. And the more restless we are, the louder the world seems. Somewhere deep inside, we know this. That's why when we finally escape to a forest path, to a quiet lake, to a place where the only sound is the wind through the trees, something inside us loosens. We breathe deeper, our shoulders drop, and for a brief moment, we remember what it feels like to simply be alive, without the need to add anything to the moment. The noise of the modern world will not disappear, but our relationship to it can change. We can learn to step out of it, not to escape life, but to return to it more fully. And that journey begins the moment we choose to truly listen. Listening is not the same as hearing. Hearing is automatic. The ear catches sound and the brain processes it. But listening, true listening, is an act of the heart. In our usual conversations, we only half listen. While the other person speaks, our mind is already preparing a reply, searching for advice to give, a story to share, or an argument to win. We wait for our turn to speak, rather than opening ourselves to truly receive. Deep listening is different. It is a kind of presence that says, without words, I am here with you. I'm not here to fix you, not here to judge you. I'm here to understand. In the Buddhist tradition, one of the most beloved figures is Avalokitesvara, in the East, known as Kuan Am, the bodhisattva who listens to the cries of the world. Her gift is not just compassion, it's the ability to listen so deeply that suffering itself begins to dissolve in the one who is heard. Thich Nh letter 1ea5t H letter 1ea1 and H once said, "The most precious gift we can offer anyone is our attention." Deep listening is that gift. It's not expensive, it doesn't require a degree, but it does require silence within us, the kind of silence that can hold another person's story without rushing to fill it. When we listen deeply, something magical happens. The person speaking begins to feel lighter, as if a hidden burden has been lifted. They may not even need advice in the end, because being heard, truly heard, is sometimes all the healing they need. And deep listening is not just for others, it is for ourselves. Have you ever noticed that the body whispers before it screams? A faint tension in the jaw before a headache, a tightness in the chest before anger bursts, a small ache in the heart before burnout arrives. If we do not listen to these whispers, they will find a way to become storms. Meditation is one of the ways Buddhism teaches us to listen inwardly. When we sit in stillness, focusing on the breath, we are not just doing nothing. We are creating a space where the mind's constant chatter begins to soften. In that softening, we start to hear the quieter truths beneath the noise, truths about what we really need, what we truly value, and what we must let go of. Listening deeply is also about hearing what is not said. In the pauses, in the hesitation, in the subtle changes of tone, lies the truth beyond words. And to sense it, we must be still enough inside. Imagine the world if more of us practiced this. Arguments would become dialogues. Conflicts would become understandings. Loneliness would shrink because people would no longer feel invisible. Deep listening is not a skill we master once and keep forever. It is a daily choice to set aside our own noise, to open the door of our awareness, and to welcome whatever arrives without judgment, without haste. And the moment we truly begin, the world starts to sound different, not because the noise is gone, but because we are no longer lost in it. We have learned to hear with the whole of our being. The Buddha did not only teach silence, he lived it. His life was filled with words that guided millions, yet some of his most powerful teachings were given without a single syllable. One such moment happened not long after his awakening. Word had spread across the plains of India that a man had found the end of suffering. People came in waves, kings with their retinues, farmers still dusted from the fields, wandering monks seeking debate. Among them was a man known for his sharp tongue, a famous debater who took pride in defeating spiritual teachers. He approached the Buddha, confident he would expose him. Without any greeting, he launched his challenge. Is the world eternal or not? Is it infinite or finite? Does the soul exist after death or vanish completely? The Buddha simply looked at him and said nothing. The silence was not awkward. It was steady. The man waited. Minutes passed. The wind rustled through the solid trees. No answer came. Frustrated, the man left. But those who had been with the Buddha understood. The questions were not asked from a place of liberation, but from a restless mind seeking to trap him. Any answer would have been fuel for more argument. Silence in that moment was the truest, most compassionate teaching. In another story, a group of monks asked the Buddha to sum up his teachings in a single sentence. He did not rush to respond. He simply sat, eyes half closed, breathing in the stillness. When he finally spoke, it was not with elaborate philosophy. He said, "Nothing is worth clinging to." Those few words born from silence carried more weight than hours of discourse. Silence also played a role in the Buddha's daily life. He would often retreat into forests or quiet groves, spending hours alone not as an escape but as a return to the stillness where insight blossoms. Even when surrounded by followers, there were times he would remain wordless, letting the presence of peace do the teaching. His disciples learned that silence was not a gap between teachings, it was the teaching. It was the space where the heart could digest what the mind had just received. Centuries later, the great Zen masters carried this forward. When asked profound questions, some would answer with a single gesture, a glance, or a pause so deep that the student would begin to question the very nature of their inquiry. The Buddha's silence was never empty. It was alive. It was like standing before a vast ocean at dawn. No words, no explanations, just the undeniable knowing that you are in the presence of something boundless. And when you experience that, you realize that silence is not the absence of teaching. It is the essence of it. Silence has a way of turning our gaze inward. When the noise of the world fades, what's left is not always peace at first. Often the first thing we hear is ourselves. At the beginning, that can be unsettling. The restless chatter of thoughts we didn't know we had. The old conversations replaying in our heads. The quiet echo of worries we've been carrying for years. It's like entering a still lake and seeing, for the first time, all the shapes moving beneath the surface. We realize that silence does not instantly erase the mind's noise, it simply makes it impossible to ignore. This is why many people feel uneasy in stillness. They turn on the radio while driving. They keep a TV playing in the background at home. They fill every pause in conversation. Because if the outer world becomes too quiet, the inner world starts to speak. And sometimes what it says is hard to hear. But in Buddhist practice, this is not something to run from. It's the very doorway to understanding. The mind, when stilled, becomes a mirror. At first, the mirror reflects the dust, the irritation, the fear, the cravings. But if we stay with it, breathing through the discomfort, the dust begins to settle. Slowly, the reflections grow clearer. We begin to see the patterns behind our reactions, the old stories we've been telling ourselves, the attachments we cling to without realizing. Silence shows us both the beauty and the chaos we carry. It reveals the tender places that need compassion, and the illusions we can finally let go of. This is why the Buddha often retreated into forests and quiet places, not because the world was too much, but because in silence, the mind's true nature becomes visible. It's like looking into a still pond and seeing not just the surface, but the depth beneath. In that depth, we discover something extraordinary. The storms of the mind are temporary. The thoughts that once seemed so urgent pass on their own when we stop feeding them. The emotions that felt overwhelming soften when we simply allow them to be. And in those rare, luminous moments, the mirror becomes completely clear. There is no dust, no distortion, just pure awareness, open and boundless. It is then that silence stops feeling like emptiness and starts feeling like home. Silence doesn't only change the way we see ourselves, it changes the way we see each other. In a world addicted to words, we often forget that connection is not built on how much we say, but on the quality of our presence. Think of the moments that have stayed with you in life. Not the long speeches, not the endless explanations, but the quiet moments sitting beside someone you love, watching the sun sink behind the hills, no words exchanged, yet feeling closer than ever. Silence can be a bridge between hearts. When we drop the need to fill every gap in conversation, we give space for something deeper to emerge, understanding without explanation, intimacy without performance. In Buddhist practice, there is the art of being with, simply sharing space with another person, letting your presence speak for you. When someone is grieving, for example, no amount of words can erase their pain. But sitting beside them, holding their hand, breathing the same still air that can speak volumes. There is also a kind of listening that only silence makes possible. When we listen without rushing to reply, we begin to hear the emotions beneath the words, the tremor in someone's voice when they speak of fear, the pause before they admit something vulnerable, the softness that appears when they speak of love. And sometimes, silence in relationships is not about what we share, but what we choose not to share. Not every thought needs to be voiced. Not every disagreement needs to be aired. Choosing silence in certain moments can be an act of kindness, a way of protecting harmony without suppressing truth. The Buddha's way of teaching often showed this balance. He spoke when words could heal, but he also knew when silence would allow the listener to find their own insight. In our own relationships, the same is true. Some truths are best discovered, not delivered. Silence can even heal wounds between people. When anger has burned through the words, when nothing said can make it better, there is sometimes only one medicine left: to sit quietly together, letting the heart remember that it is more important to love than to win. The irony is that in learning to be silent with others, we often end up speaking more authentically when we do speak. Because when words arise from stillness, they carry the weight of sincerity. In this way, silence is not the absence of communication. It is the foundation of it. It is what allows the truth between two hearts to breathe. Deep listening is not just a gift we're born with. It's a skill one we can nurture, refine, and carry into every moment of our lives. In Buddhism, listening is a form of meditation. It's not simply about hearing sound, it's about cultivating a mind that can receive without grasping, a heart that can hold without judgment. But in the noise of modern life, this doesn't happen by accident. It needs intention. It needs practice. Here are ways to begin. First, create a pocket of silence each day. Even 10 minutes will change you. Sit somewhere still, a quiet room, a park bench, the edge of your bed before dawn. Close your eyes and simply listen, not for anything specific. Just let the world arrive, the hum of distant traffic, the breath in your chest, the faint creak of the walls. At first, the mind will want to fill the space. Thoughts will knock like impatient visitors. Let them pass. Return to the listening. Second, walk without speaking. Choose a familiar path through a park, down a quiet street, even from your desk to the kitchen. Leave your phone behind. Don't plan your next task. Just walk, feeling the ground beneath your feet, noticing the rhythm of your steps. Let the world speak to you, the wind against your cheek, the crunch of gravel, the shifting light through the trees. Third, practice listening without reply. The next time someone speaks to you, resist the urge to jump in with a response. Just receive their words. Look into their eyes. Notice the tone, the pauses, the emotions that rise and fall. Let there be a breath or two after they finish. You may find that what you would have said is no longer what needs to be said. Fourth, listen to nature as a teacher. Buddhist monks often meditate in forests because nature speaks in the language of patience. Sit by a river and hear the endless, unhurried flow. Stand beneath trees and listen to leaves dancing with the wind. These sounds remind us that life is always happening now, in the present moment, and that we can join it if we listen. Fifth, end your day in quiet reflection. Before you sleep, sit for a few minutes with the lights off. Replay the day not as a critic, but as a witness. Notice the moments you truly listened. Notice the moments you didn't. No judgment, just awareness. This gentle noticing will naturally make you a better listener tomorrow. The more we practice, the more listening becomes our natural state. We start to hear beyond words, sensing the unspoken, feeling the spaces between sentences. We begin to notice that silence itself is full of meaning, full of connection. Deep listening is not about perfect technique. It's about presence. It's about meeting each sound, each word, each heartbeat with openness, as if this moment is the only one that exists. And in truth, it is. True revolutions rarely begin with fanfare. They don't always roar through the streets or demand the world's attention. Sometimes the most radical change begins in a place so quiet you can hear your own breath. When we embrace silence, we are not retreating from life. We are stepping into its deepest current. We are no longer chasing after the noise, the opinions, the endless echo of our own thoughts. Instead, we are turning inward, toward the stillness that has been waiting for us all along. In Buddhist teaching, this is the beginning of true liberation. Not because silence magically erases our problems, but because it changes the one who faces them. Think about it, the mind in constant noise is like muddy water. Every ripple stirs more silt, clouding the depths. But when the water becomes still, the mud settles and clarity emerges. In that clarity, we begin to see our lives with unshaken honesty. The illusions we once defended fall away. The fears we once obeyed lose their grip. This is why silence is revolutionary. It dismantles the tyranny of distraction. It teaches us to listen to the voice beneath all other voices, the one that speaks only truth. At first, this revolution may feel unsettling. Without the noise, we meet ourselves fully, without disguise. We see our restlessness, our wounds, our unfulfilled longings. But instead of running, we stay. We breathe. We allow the heart to soften, to forgive, to open again. Slowly, silence shifts from being an empty space to being a sacred space. It becomes the ground where wisdom grows. We notice that our reactions lose their sharpness, our speech carries more weight, and our presence becomes a refuge for others. And here's the paradox: the more we cultivate this inner quiet, the more alive the world becomes. Colors seem richer, conversations carry deeper meaning. Even the smallest moments, the sip of tea, the sound of rain, become luminous. The inner revolution of silence is not about withdrawing from the world. It's about returning to it transformed. It's about stepping back into life with eyes that truly see, ears that truly hear, and a heart that is unshakably present. And when that happens, silence stops being something we practice. It becomes who we are. Silence is never truly empty. Beneath it, there is a voice that does not shout or argue but simply is. It's the voice you've heard in fleeting moments when you stood before a sunrise and forgot your worries, when the night was still and the stars seemed infinite, when a single breath felt like enough. It's the voice of your own awakened heart. This voice doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't hand you a map. It simply reminds you, you are already home. In the life of the Buddha, silence was not an absence. It was the purest form of presence. He spoke when words were needed, and when they were not, he let the silence speak for him. Sometimes the greatest teaching is not something you hear, but something you feel. And maybe, just maybe, that's what you've been longing for all along. Not more answers, not more noise, but this. The space to listen deeply, to yourself, to life, to the truth that has always been here. Silence is the bridge between who you think you are and who you truly are. It is the moment the waves settle and you finally see your own reflection. It is the invitation to return again and again to the place where nothing is missing. So, the next time the world demands you speak, ask yourself, is this a moment for words or a moment for listening? Because in the quiet, you may hear the only voice that truly matters. If this message touched something deep within you, consider making space for more moments like this in your life. And if you wish to walk further on this path with us, the path of wisdom, compassion, and inner stillness, you are warmly invited to join our community here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Simply subscribe and let's continue exploring together, not in a rush, not in noise, but in the calm rhythm of mindful living. Your presence here matters more than you know.